trade area as one potential outcome of Brexit that would certainly benefit Africa, and it definitely is an opportunity. And I think that we have a distinguished panel, including Tim Loughton, Member of Parliament, British politician, who will have to leave us at 4, so we'll let him speak first, as well as His Excellence Mr. Odin Ajumo Gobia. I'm so sorry, I'm sure I butchered that. And who is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Nigeria, as well as, to his right, Shankar Singham, the incoming Director of International Trade Competition at the Institute of Economic Affairs. People who really will know what Brexit will mean for Africa. Let's start right now with each speaker will have 5 to 7 minutes to give their opening remarks, and then we will open it up to questions. We will start with Tim Loughton as we have to lead it for.
Right, is this working? What makes the explosion noises is the thing happening. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm sorry we're running slightly late, but we have some votes in the House of Commons this afternoon, so I'm under pain of death to return to. But I just want to make a few comments. I'm by no means the expert on this panel. I'm a Conservative MP. I was one of those who campaigned vigorously in favour of Brexit, and I chaired a large group of Conservative MPs ahead of the referendum who spent a lot of time speaking to other European politicians as to what reforms we could achieve within the EU that might have meant it was more likely for the UK to stay within the EU in the referendum. In the event that didn't happen, we weren't offered a proper reform deal. I think that was a great pity, not just for the UK, but I think it also suggested a sense of denial by the European Union that they were capable of reforming themselves, and therefore I think it's just not sustainable in the long term. So I have serious reservations about the ability of the EU to continue to compete in an increasingly global and competitive world where we see increasingly restrictive and internal practices within the EU. Now, I think there are going to be big implications for African countries in particular, and I have to say I'm a big fan of the Commonwealth, and I think there are huge opportunities for the UK to re-cement and promote its connections with Commonwealth countries. And as a minister previously within the Department for Education, I attended Commonwealth countries and saw the benefits of greater Commonwealth cooperation. And recently I've been visiting a number of African countries who are very keen on joining the Commonwealth, even though they are former French colonies in many respects. And as the president of one of those candidate countries said to me recently, we've had a look at all the African countries, and it seems to be those that are Commonwealth countries seem to be doing rather better economically and have a rather brighter future. It would be stupid not to want to be part of that. So I think the future is bright for the Commonwealth. And for those who took a different view in Brexit, and accused those of us who wanted to leave the EU as in some way being inward-looking, isolationist and Little Englanders, and the whole point of Brexit is that we want to re-engage with the 6.9 billion people who happen not to live within the EU, rather than just the 510 million who are part of the population of EU countries. And I think the other thing that's important to say is that the EU portrays itself as a free trade area. I think many African countries, more than many, know it's no such thing. It's a protectionist zone, and that many African economies have been some of the biggest casualties of that protectionism. I am annoyed that much of the aid money, which we quite rightly in the UK and in other Western countries pay to developing economies in Africa and elsewhere, is effectively given with one hand and taken with the other. I remember visiting Ethiopia, not a Commonwealth country, but an African country, to be told that there are more Ethiopian doctors in New York than there are in the whole of Ethiopia. And we are paying money for education, for health, and all sorts of other very important causes in many developing countries, only then to take those people to the West when we desperately need them to help form part of the emerging economies in many of these countries at home. And again, one of the things that really annoyed me is that we slap, or the EU slaps, huge tariffs on many agricultural products imported from Africa. It is a nonsense that there is a tariff of something like 30% on processed coffee, cocoa products from several African countries. It is a nonsense that the tariffs on oranges imported from South Africa, for example, went up from 3% to 16% just to protect the citrus industry in Spain. And with a country that has such a heavy reliance on agriculture and the use of land, it's crazy that Africa is importing 80% of its food supplies. And there are some 600 million hectares of uncultivable land. That is a nonsense. So after Brexit, I hope that we will be able to re-establish direct links with many African countries, starting with our Commonwealth countries, to have much greater, closer relations between our people and integration of people's coming here and UK nationals going to African countries. I want to see far greater cooperation between UK businesses helping to start up businesses and starting new trade links with many African countries. And that's been a focus of the International Development Department, to whether we're taking groups of businessmen and women to East African Commonwealth countries, for example, to see what investment in businesses and those trading opportunities that can result from that. And I hope we will, as has been said by the Trade Secretary over here, we will continue existing duty-free and customs-free arrangements we have with Commonwealth countries, but extend that. If we are genuinely to work in partnership, if we are genuinely to see the benefits of money invested in many African countries and business opportunities by investors from the UK and other countries, then it needs to be done on an equal basis, and we need to have proper trading arrangements that don't mean dumping agricultural products in particular on African countries, but a proper partnership that leads to growing economies, growing trade opportunities, and at last, free of the EU, we will be able to achieve that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your remarks. So the statistics you cited about tariffs are very enlightening. I had no idea they were that high in agricultural goods. We will now hear from His Excellency, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Nigeria.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think the theme of this summit, common good, is particularly apt in talking about this subject this afternoon on opportunities for Africa under Brexit. Are there going to be new opportunities for Africa? I think the answer really is maybe. It really depends on what Africa does for itself. Now, when we talk about Africa, there's a tendency to look at Africa as one whole. It's actually 54 different countries. Only 18 of them are in the Commonwealth. And I think that's an important point to note. Rwanda was, I think, the last to join the Commonwealth in 2009. They were not a British colony, as many of the African countries that are in the Commonwealth were. We heard today the Minister of Environment of Sudan talking about his hope that Sudan will join the Commonwealth. So there are probably benefits in terms of the growth that's seen by non-Commonwealth countries in Africa from joining the Commonwealth. But beyond that, Brexit caused panic around the world, the global markets, not just in Africa, but around the world. Why? Because we got used to Britain being part of the EU, and nobody knew exactly what the implications would be of Britain's exit from the European Union. Now, on the surface, it's probable that it opens opportunities for bilateral trade between countries in Africa and Britain, bilateral trade between countries within Africa. Now, and I think that the the challenge in talking about partnerships, and now I talk as an African, is the unequal terms of such partnerships. The former President of Ghana spoke about the EPA, and I think that's a very important initiative because agriculture is, everyone recognizes agriculture is at the heart of diversification and growth in Africa. Now, Nigeria, I had something to do with Nigeria not signing the EPA because there's a tension between private European private interests and African policy that's going to drive growth in Africa. Now, if Africa is trying to grow its economy, and I'm not simply talking about GDP numbers and so on, I'm talking about growth that creates jobs. And that's ultimately what it's about. It's about creating jobs in Africa. We heard earlier that 70% of Nigeria's population is probably under 30. 70% of the African population is probably in that same ballpark. Now, if Africa doesn't grow, unemployment derives from lack of growth. And if Africa continues to export primary products, which is it's the bane of Africa's challenge, then there will simply not be the growth that's required to drive development and create employment in African countries. And so I wanted to spend the rest of my time talking about how Africa can benefit from Brexit. And I think it's really through focusing on African integration. If Nigeria, some of the countries in Africa are very small, and as economies, they really have no leverage in negotiating with partners, whether it's Britain or whether it's with the EU. And I therefore think that the focus has to be on strengthening the regional groups, ECOWAS, CADC, the East African Community, so that you can have a platform on which to have negotiations in partnership with whether it's Britain or with the EU. I think NEPAD, the New African Partnership for Development, was a very important initiative. It seems to have lost some steam since President Obasanjo left the presidency of Nigeria and South Africa as well, that drove that initiative. I think we should go back to NEPAD and look at the policies through which we can achieve greater integration. Now, I believe that a prosperous Africa is going to be an asset to the world. And I think it's important for the world to recognize that and help Africa. I mean, Africa must take the lead. We have to do many things. We have to achieve better integration. We have to introduce better governance. It's improving. We've talked about democracy being consolidated in Africa. And I think in that regard, we shouldn't be focused so much on the form rather than the substance of representative government that's accountable to the people. Now, if we can do that and do some of those things that Africa must do to be able to leverage on its huge potential, imagine a world in which Africa suddenly stopped exporting primary products. That would be a challenge for the rest of the world. And I think, therefore, Africa must come together to integrate and create platforms on which we can negotiate terms of trade. Free trade simply doesn't exist, and Donald Trump is now talking about America First and putting tariffs on steel. It's created a huge reaction around the world. Now, I think that's the same, for the same reasons, Africa can't act on its own. It must take the lead. There are certain things it must do in creating this new partnership, promoting trade and investment. I think by the same token, Britain and the EU have an interest in investing in Africa and promoting investment and growth in Africa to create markets even for themselves. This huge population in Africa that's going to be 2.3 billion people by 2050 is potentially a huge market for goods and services coming from the rest of the world, whether it's EU or Britain, or within Africa itself. There's a lot of trade that can take place between Africa that's not taking place and will not take place as long as these historical ties are not broken. So from that point of view, I think Brexit is a good thing for Africa, for us to go back to the drawing board, look at our opportunities and refashion our trade policies for the benefit of Africa. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. So far we have a yes, a maybe, and Mr. Singham, your remarks.
First of all, I'd like to comment on your comment about this is an opportunity to refashion trade policy and to rethink development policy, and I think that's an incredibly important comment. And I think this is the opportunity that the UK has. If I can say a couple of things about the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is really, it isn't a bloc, it isn't a zone as such, it's an alignment of nations. And there is a shared commitment in the Commonwealth to things like the rule of law and common law and these sorts of things. And actually, to your point, where I came from, the Garton Institute, has a prosperity index, and actually we see that Commonwealth countries outperform their groupings, their affinity groups. So the Commonwealth countries, the most developed ones, outperform the Nordics. The African Commonwealth countries outperform the non-Commonwealth countries in Africa. And we see, and I think the Secretariat has noted an 18% uplift of Commonwealth countries. So it's an alignment of nations, and it's a network. And actually, David Howell has talked very eloquently about what a powerful network the Commonwealth actually is. If we don't seek to make it an agreement amongst countries, but actually allow it to become the powerful network that it is. I was recently at the WTO ministerial meeting, and I was thinking, if the Commonwealth countries had met, the trade ministers had met as a group prior to the WTO ministerial, without even agreeing anything, but simply thrashing out these issues, I think that we might have had a different result in the ministerial. So we need to exploit that. We haven't exploited the network effects of the Commonwealth. We keep trying to make it something it isn't. But it is a very powerful network. There is no network in the world that consists of countries that are the most developed countries in the world and very small microstates. There is nothing like it. And each of those countries has an affinity group in the world, whether it's in the WTO or in the OECD or in the G77 or whatever you want to talk about. So that's some comments about the Commonwealth and the importance of the Commonwealth. I think in terms of UK trade policy post-Brexit, I actually wrote an op-ed 2 days before the referendum in favour of Remain, but very reluctantly in favour of Remain. My position and the work that we have done historically at the Garton and in the future at the IEA is very much focused on the British people voted to leave. So now what we have to do is leave the European Union well and embrace the rest of the world well in trade policy terms. And that means a trade policy that is built on what you do unilaterally, what you can do to improve your own domestic regulatory environment in the UK, and your own tariff schedules. So we must have control of our tariff schedules, and we must have control of our regulatory systems. What we can do bilaterally. So unilaterally, there are things that we can do. We can lower tariffs for agricultural products, for example, things that we don't produce, things that are not competitive. Most developing countries produce products that UK farmers don't produce. There's no reason, you go to Spanish, for example, on citrus, but there are many, many examples of things where we have a tariff that we don't need to have. And I would advocate lowering that. Many of the barriers, though, to developing country exports of agricultural products into the European Union, there is a tariff barrier, but there is also a regulatory barrier. So whether it's basmati rice from India or palm oil from Malaysia or whatever it happens to be, it's not actually the tariff that is the barrier. There's a regulatory barrier, usually based on some, I would describe, ferocious interpretation of the proportion principle in the European Union, which bans the products of developing countries. Not just makes them very expensive, bans them completely. So there are things that we can do there. Bilaterally, agreements with other countries, and everyone focuses, I think, in this discussion on the big players, obviously the US and so on. But here I think this is where I think there is this opportunity, where we can say, look, We want to have real, true economic partnership agreements, which are actually partnership agreements. Here's what we do, and this is not just the US and European Union, it's most developed countries. We apply very high tariffs and tariff escalators to the agricultural products that come from developing countries. And then we say, mea culpa, we did a bad thing. What we're going to do is we're going to give you a preference. Now, there are a handful of very, very small, very poor countries which will give everything but arms in the European Union. In other words, these are preferences, zero tariffs that can't change. But this is a very small group of the least developed countries. For other countries, most of the countries in the developing world we're talking about, we say we'll give you a preference, so you have this lower tariff rate. But if I am, in fact, a farmer in a country like Ghana, like a cocoa producer in Ghana, I have a 4% tariff if I go up the value chain and I make chocolate and I sell it in Europe or whatever. But I could lose that preference for things that I have no control over. The country, I'm damaged by success, because if the country graduates out of the preference program, I lose that. And that 4% tariff goes to a 40% chocolate tariff. So I cannot change my supply chains based on a preference, because it might go for reasons that I have no control over. So this is why the escalation effect of the tariff continues to apply to the supply chain. It's why many of the African countries can't go up the value chain. Their producers can't go up the value chain. So I suggest what we can do instead is actually be open. Shocking thought. We should actually be open to the agricultural products of the developing world, Africa in particular. That is a better development strategy than almost anything you could do. And then understand that yes, we are moving from one world, the preference world, to a world of competition. And these countries will be competing, and their companies will be competing against other developing countries. And they will be competing against countries that artificially subsidize some of these products. And so we have to have a mechanism, and it has to be real, where we say to them, look, if you are in fact in competition with highly distorted products from other places, we have a mechanism to protect you from that sort of unfair competition. But we also have to do something else. We have to say, look, we're asking you to change your whole process, because what you're currently doing is relying on the preference, and therefore doing some non-economic things to rely on the preference. We want to move to a more open trade, more competitive world, and therefore use some of our aid funding and some of our prosperity funds in the Foreign Office, for example, to allow industries to retool, to allow people to go up the value chain with good marketing plans and so forth, but not to do it in a dependency creating kind of fashion, but to do it as a one-off. We recognise that there are some changes that you're going to have to make. That is a real economic partnership. That is a partnership of equals. And that is the sort of thing that the UK, as a result of leaving the European Union, can move towards. Now, we won't move towards it immediately. We will port over the current preference mechanisms, and we will try to keep everything as similar as it currently is. But there is an opportunity to do this. And I think what I would say to African countries in the Commonwealth is this is a great opportunity for you. And I will be knocking on the door of Liam Foss and the Department of International Trade and demanding this kind of change, in fact. Not just saying we're afraid that preferences will go, but to demand this kind of change. And then what the UK can do plurilaterally, accede to existing regional platform agreements. We've talked about accession of the UK to the TPP, for example. And then multilaterally, operating in the WTO and in global standard setting organisations. Now, there's another dimension to that is very important for Africa and very important for developing agricultural industries, which is one of the things that's happened as a result of the EU's approach to food standards and food safety. Is the Codex Alimentarius, which is the global organisation which determines food standards and food safety, has really been blown up. I mean, the Europeans have basically said, well, we're going to adopt our own approach to these things, and deviated significantly from the Codex. So I think the UK having a much more strong role in organisations like that to ensure that globally we have food standards, etc., food safety, that is based on sound science, that is not based on a desire to protect local industries, which we see too often, as you described very eloquently in Europe, but actually based on sound science and actually in compliance with the rules of the World Trade Organization. So there are some things that the UK can do there. If it's successful, and if other countries are successful in ensuring that, then some of these bans that I talked about would not actually impact the goods and agricultural products of developing countries and African countries so much. So I will stop there, and I'm sure there will be questions of that.
Thank you very much for that. We have time now for about 10 minutes of questions, but I'd like to take my prerogative as the moderator to ask the first question to our Member of Parliament here, who was speaking earlier about African countries wanting to join the Commonwealth. Are there any in particular that you might name, or more likely, how likely do you think that is to happen this year? We have the head of state meeting coming up soon. What is the outlook for them?
Well, we've heard already about Rwanda was the last new member to the
For them, Mozambique.
Mozambique before that. I was in Madagascar in November, and completely unprompted, our first meeting with the president of Madagascar said how keen they were on looking at the joining the Commonwealth. And it's him who'd done the assessment of prospects of other countries. And in fact, that was mentioned time and time again in the various meetings we had with parliamentarians and others there. And I know there are other countries in West Africa as well, mostly French, ex-French colonial countries. It's something of a coup, because Madagascar is currently the president of the Francophone African countries, so if it decides to defect from south of English Channel to northern Channel, it could create quite a stir. But I mean, I think they make a fair point. There is a greater affinity, I think, amongst those Commonwealth nations. There are greater commonalities as well, beyond just language and legal systems. And I think there's a closer relationship with the UK than perhaps they would have with France or other colonial powers as well. So I just think there is a huge opportunity. As we've heard, I mean, the problem is Commonwealth is not a trading bloc. If you put together the various economies, it's actually quite a big organisation, although it's obviously heavily biased towards India and Canada. But I just think the opportunities that Brexit brings up on a proper partnership basis, as Chandler said, are greater now than they have been for many, many years.
And with that, I will open it up to questions from the floor.
Thank you very much. I have two questions, one for the Member of Parliament and one for the economist. I think Africa has come a long way, and coming from the United Nations, we like to think that some of the problems we have to solve in Africa, we have to think across all nations, whether they're Francophone or Anglophone. And so, for instance, the Great Green Wall that we're looking at is benefiting countries in the region, because drought and some of these problems are not country-specific or, And my question is, we've come a long way from the 90s, as I recall, as a student, about the tensions that there were between the Francophone countries in Africa and the Anglophone countries. I think there's been a lot more working together. And I'm just wondering how, having the Brexit and having the Commonwealth resurgence, and the Europeans going their way probably with the Francophone African, what threat is there of destabilizing this kind of cohesion we've developed over the years? Because I think for the common good we might want to work together. I'm just wondering what threat there is, if any. With respect to the market question, it's puzzled me. I live in Germany, and it puzzles me every time I go to the supermarket that I can buy bananas from Latin America, and I can get sweet potatoes from Latin America, but I'm not able to get sweet potatoes from Rwanda. They're not coming in, but through the Asia-Africa shops, not through the open market. What really is the problem with the tariffs here? I just want to understand. Thank you.
Sorry, just on that question. Not products like bananas obviously benefit from the Cotonou agreements and all kinds of preference programs with respect to Latin America, and this point illustrates the unfairness actually of some of these arrangements. Because if you happen to be very good at lobbying, and you happen to be represented by a major importer, then you get a better deal in terms of access to the EU. And so the banana wars were basically fought between two banana importers. This was really unusual. They happened to be, one happened to have a lot of production in Latin America, Honduras, and other places. Another happened to have production in the English-speaking Caribbean. And there was a battle between them. And, in different ways, consumers at the end of the day are the ones who lose out. I think your particular example in some of the other areas, these are probably caused by regulatory barriers as opposed to the tariffs. So that's probably the issue. It's certainly true that most of the products that are not able to enter the EU market at all they're not coming in because of the tariff. They're not coming in because of a regulatory barrier or a sanitary or phytosanitary measure.
Okay, we have 5 minutes according to my clock before we have to wrap up this panel. Let's take a panel from questions. From beyond the road.
Hello. A question regarding the possible strategy of the UK board. Would they or should they prefer to engage with the economic communities in Africa, or maybe look for deals with heavyweight like Nigeria and other big economies in Africa?
And just to wrap in the last question that you asked also, and coming back on something you said actually earlier on, trade policy will only get you so far. So it's important. There are great opportunities, I think, as a result of Brexit. But what African nations do for themselves is far more important. And the regulatory reforms and so forth that African nations embrace themselves is where the gains will be. And therefore, to that end, actually being more open to each other as well, building on some of the regional arrangements and having genuine freedom of movement of goods and so forth and services between African countries is, I think, incredibly important. And in terms of engagement with who should the UK engage with, I think you move forward. Trade policy tends to be a game of opportunities. So if an opportunity presents itself, countries should definitely take those. I think we'll have an approach to the smaller countries that is more based on EPA type arrangements, but hopefully EPA type arrangements in the way that I've described, as opposed to the current EPA type arrangements, which I agree very one-sided and very unfair. And then with the major countries, I think there's one issue which is an issue of capacity, and so it's unlikely that the UK will suddenly embrace lots and lots of bilateral trade deals. But certainly these regional groupings, not so much in Africa but other Commonwealth areas. TPP, for example, has many Commonwealth countries. That's, I think, where the policy will go.
Thank you very much. Again, I asked this question for those of you who were in last year's event. I'm not one of those people that would easily ask, Greeks, what can they do for us? Rather, I would ask back home, what can we do for them? And the answer is very simple. Are we ready to take the opportunities that are coming? I have yet to see any of the 18 Commonwealth countries set up anything as an assessment mission, as a team that needs to examine the opportunities that are likely to come from Brexit. I might be wrong, but I'm yet to see anyone in this space. I'm yet to see anyone who is looking at our current export promotion policies and seeing how can we reposition ourselves to take advantage of the EU exit. I'm yet to see it. I'm yet to see organizations that are aligning in terms of the Horn of Africa, the West Coast, and the opportunities that are going to come. I'm yet to see all of this. So for me, I want to ask, what can we do for them, rather than what can they do for us? Thank you.
I think that's an excellent point, and we've heard a lot about what we need is partnerships, regional platforms getting together to, one, show that they're able to trade with each other on a much freer basis, and that they're in a position to be able then to trade and form agreements on various platforms with the UK. There is another elephant in the room here, and this is aimed particularly outside of Commonwealth countries in Africa. That corruption is still a huge barrier to investment. I remember at the World Bank conference last year, just about every delegate there was complaining about corruption with their own countries, and it's the biggest break on the way we use aid because of the portrayals, and in many cases the caricatures, of where that money is ending up. The Commonwealth, I think, has a huge advantage over many other African countries where we have that common affinity to the rule of law, where I think we are better placed to root out corruption where it stands. And if we can do that, I mean, certainly I met a number of businesses when I went to Madagascar, before I went and when I was there, and most of them were on the verge of leaving or had left because of the huge corruption that just prevented them getting any proper investment going in that country. Forget Brexit and everything else, the biggest single bar to development in so much of Africa is the failure to act on corruption, and the Commonwealth is better placed than anybody to take up those cudgels and do something about it.
Thank you.
One quick thing. What I would suggest that you do, if the 18 Commonwealth countries in Africa were to together, as perhaps as some sort of Commonwealth initiative, inventory the barriers that they face in the UK right now, because, and most of those barriers are European barriers, and say, well, this is what we want. We want you to eliminate these barriers as you come out of the European Union. Now, maybe the UK will not be able to eliminate all of them. Maybe that will be negotiated, but that would be a very good start, and that would be, again, that's what partners do.
Yes, I just wanted to comment on, I can't resist commenting on the issue of corruption. I mean, it's clearly an issue. But I recall when I was foreign minister, there was a scandal in FIFA, and there was allegations against several top echelon of FIFA. But all papers across the world, including local papers, named the Nigerian and three others. The three others were European, American, and Asian. There was a Nigerian whose name was in the papers. And I think that there's a tendency, I like the word caricature, I think there's a tendency to focus unduly on the issue of corruption. Corruption exists, and it's a terrible thing. It does a lot of havoc in Africa. But I think that's separate from the issues of equal partnerships, which are critical. Africa needs to produce 20 million jobs a year for the next 20 years if we're going to get out of our current rut. That's not going to happen with the sort of partnerships that we have today. And I think unless these partnerships are designed to create growth, as I said before, and create value and create employment, it's just simply not going to work. And so I agree with the speaker who said we have to look at ourselves and see what we can do. We can't do it on a country-by-country basis. We have to do it as a bloc.
Thank you, sir.
Very much.
Okay, one last question, very quick, because I need to back to money.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My question is not really a question, but to congratulate the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Archie Koba, for the work that they've currently done in Port Harcourt. And I really enjoyed taking a delegate of 42 people in their part of the world. But I think the question about Brexit is, for me, I'm in favor of the British people staying in the EU. And I voted recently in the Lib Dem to support that British people should have the last say in terms of having this idea of, not MPs voting on behalf of us. So I voted just the other day, on Saturday or Friday, expressing my interest on behalf of Commonwealth as well. And I spoke passionately about that as a Lib Dem wearing that hat right now. My question is about how do you, and I extend my gratitude to the gentleman over here, how does our governments across Africa support the diaspora over here in investment? And I disagree with the gentleman over in the middle on the basis that in Kenya, for instance, flowers, when it goes to Amsterdam, the EU is in favor of supporting the African nation. And I've had several times my party leader, Vince Cable, stating that the EU is not interested in Britain, for instance, if we come, Commonwealth will lose. So I'm asking you to elaborate that matter further to help Commonwealth benefit appropriately. Thank you.
Someone respond to on that?
Well, it's you.
It is pretty clear, if you just look at the tariff schedules of the European Union, that they are highly protectionist in agricultural products against the products of developing countries. And as I explained, they correct this by preference programs. I don't think that is good for developing countries, and I don't think that is good for development. I think being open to the products of developing countries is a much better way forward.
Can I leave a parting shot on another protectionist example of that? From 2014, I think the whole of Africa made just under $2.4 billion from coffee exports. In the same year, Germany made $3.8 billion from coffee exports, and they don't even produce coffee beans. And that came mostly from Africa. I think that just about says it all. I'm going now to vote.
Thank you so much. Let's give a big round of applause for our panelists.
I just have a short comment. I once read an article. It said Africa doesn't need funding, Africa needs leadership. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. So
It's both. It's both.
Yeah. We are the guys who need to bring everything out. We believe in that. But we shouldn't. This is not about charity. Money is fine, but it's not about charity. It's about bringing the elements together, but also the capability. So skills, education, and looking forward looking. That's important.
Okay, I think we have to start our next panel, so we're going to have to end right there. Let's give a big round of applause to all the panelists. Obviously,